Greetings. My name is Susan Bacchius, and with the help of some wonderful people, I put together an exhibit on the life and works of David Rittenhouse for the Rittenhouse home site. This is the parlor, and we used some of the things that are Rittenhouse site property, like this lovely Rittenhouse clock that stands in this room. We have a compass made in Rittenhouse's workshop by his brother. And we have some books and a coin, some other artifacts of his life. So we integrated those into an exhibit that talks about his life, and the life is, he lived 64 years, and we've divided that by 4, and each wall represents a period of his life. This wall is the first 14 years, and it's entitled Passionate Student. It's about his young years and his what he was learning and doing as a young man. The second is titled Instrument Maker, and this was his next 14 years, his career beginnings, where his father let him build a shop where he could make fine instruments like telescopes and surveying gear. And he worked his way into clocks, the Franklin Institute knows of 40 clocks that he made, but it may be many more. And then he moved into the city of Philadelphia, married, had a family, and worked on more sophisticated undertakings like the orrery and the astronomical researches. He became part of the American Philosophical Society. And then in the last period of his life, he was an institution builder with the U.S. Mint, with the American Philosophical Society, and with the Democratic Republicans in Pennsylvania. This exhibit also takes as a focus his relationship with Thomas Jefferson. Rittenhouse was well known to our founding fathers, and Jefferson was an ongoing correspondent, as this part of the exhibit testifies to. Rittenhouse Town has had a David Rittenhouse Award in the past, in which people who are active in fields that were areas of excellence for David are noted and celebrated. That would have been Derek Pitts, Owen Gingrich from Harvard University, Keith Thompson from the American Philosophical Society, and John Mercanti from the U.S. Mint. David Rittenhouse was born in 1732. He was born in this building. His father was one of the sons of Nicholas Rittenhouse and Wilhelmina Dewey's. In 1734, Nicholas died, and his eldest son, William, took over the running of the paper mill. At that time, the Matthias Rittenhouse family took the opportunity to move to Norristown, where they had a country house and ran a farm. That house still exists. You can go by it today. It's now the Valley Forge Medical Center, and it's had some additions and some changes, but it's still there. David, besides the 10 children that were in that Rittenhouse family, they were accompanied in their move by the brother and sister of his mother. His uncle, his mother's brother, was David. not Rittenhouse, but David, and David Rittenhouse was named after him. This Uncle David was young David's mentor for the rest of his life. Uncle David was a worker in wood and did very fine woodwork. And he taught David how to use his fine woodworking tools. So we know that at age 8, young David made a watermill. Well, David would have known what a watermill looked like. He came from this place that had one. But he was using these instruments to make something that also had moving parts. That's pretty sophisticated for an 8-year-old. Uncle David also understood this boy's intellectual capabilities, and they would watch the heavens at night. This tells of an incident in 1743 when a 9-year-old David stayed up late with his uncle, and they viewed a lunar eclipse. One would like to think that the uncle knew enough about the heavens, and as we will see later, perhaps he did, to understand what that meant, that the moon was going through the Earth's shadow as the sun shone on the plain. We also know that there was an earthquake in the area, and David reported when he was 5 years old that it sounded like a great multitude running to and fro in the loft overhead. Very apt words. It is reported that David, at age 13, read the work of Sir Isaac Newton, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. This was a work that was key to the scientific development that was going on in that age. And it's believed that Uncle David, who had died the year before, left young David his tools and his books so that young David had access to this work in English. This was the beginning of Newton's discovery and characterization of the calculus, although in this English language version of it, he did not specifically talk about the calculus. However, David was smart enough as a kid, as a young man, to realize that the calculus was embedded in the rationale that Newton was using. But David had his own word for it. He called it fluxions. There's also stories by his brothers and sisters that when David was out working on the farm, he had a piece of charcoal in his hand, or chalk, and he would write mathematical equations on the back of a shovel or a fence post. His mind was always active. As we move on in his life, in 1751, he had a new neighbor. This was Thomas Barton, a young man who had been educated at the University of Dublin. Now, David Rittenhouse didn't have any formal education. He was self-taught. When he met Thomas Barton out here in Norriton, it was a big moment for him. And he and Barton created a library, they created a school, they went off in the direction of higher learning, and David was very happy. And it just so happened that Thomas Barton married David's sister, Esther, in 1753, and went from being friend to family. David, given the information and skills that his Uncle David had instilled in him, young David began to make some pretty sophisticated devices in wood. One of the first devices he made was a wooden clock. This is not the wooden clock that David made. We don't have one of those. But it is on loan, and it's of the period. And he went from wooden instruments to wanting to do more demanding metal instruments. Now, his father wanted him to work on the farm and contribute to the family income. After a series of conversations, David convinced him that instrument making was the direction he should be going in. And his father supported him, gave him an area of the farm in which he built a work building so that he and his brother could have an instrument making enterprise. And his father lent him the money to buy the tools that he needed. So David embarked on the career that he wanted and began making some very sophisticated instruments, transit telescopes. This is a theodolite. These were important for the surveying that was going on in our young country. People would be granted pieces of land by the king or others, or even in a sale, but until there were markings on the ground, people didn't know what they owned. And so you find that George Washington was a surveyor, Thomas Jefferson's father was a surveyor, and David Rittenhouse supported this, was a surveyor, and supported the surveying trade by making things like this compass with these sight guides so that you could look ahead and project where you wanted to be. This is a chain made by his brother. It's a half chain, that is, it's 33 feet long. These guys were hiking through dense forests over rocks, and they had to make a straight line. 33 feet of chain was easier to manipulate than 66 feet. So we're lucky to have the original pole, compass, and chain. And clockmaking was an important part of his trade. There is pictured here a number of the clocks that still exist and are in public institutions in the Philadelphia area. This one at the American Philosophical Society was used by David and his compatriots for their astronomical viewings. The Drexel clock is very famous. It had the action of all of the planets known at the time. This one still exists at Montgomery County Historical Society, at Pennsylvania Hospital, and at Franklin Institute. One of the reasons for building an exhibit in this room is this room has a purported David Rittenhouse clock. We're lucky to have it. It's a beauty. And it marks the point in his life when he married, 1766, and his life is pretty well established as an instrument maker. He has taken over residence of the family farm. He has his first child in 1766 and his second child in 1767. He becomes a member of the American Philosophical Society. This was the organization established by Benjamin Franklin and led by Benjamin Franklin until his death. And David Rittenhouse became the second president. But he started as a humble member in 1768, finding collegiality among these brilliant men who gathered in Philadelphia. It's probably one of the factors that led him to relocate a couple years later. So there was a major event in the skies. It was publicized by Edmund Halley in 1716, the first global astronomical event. Halley calculated that the next transit of Venus would be in 1769, and the world should get ready. And astronomers from around the world positioned themselves to make observations. The American Philosophical Society decided that America should participate, and they established 4 sites. One was the observatory built by David Rittenhouse on his family farm in Norriton in 1768. He not only built the observatory, but he built a transit telescope. He built this clock. Evidently, precise timing is very important, and this simply framed clock was, with its highly accurate mechanism, was something he used in conjunction with his astronomy for the rest of his life. He always built an observatory where he lived, as we will see. So David was, the time of observation was June 3rd to 4th of 1769. He and his colleagues camped out that evening in his little observatory, and his colleagues were Dr. William Smith, who would figure in his life in many places. Dr. Smith was the head of the College of Philadelphia, soon to become the University of Pennsylvania, and he was an influential man in the colony. And he was accompanied by John Lukens, the Surveyor General of the state of Pennsylvania. The telescope was gifted by the Penn family in England to America. It later became resident at the University of Pennsylvania. The story goes that when the transit happened, and David has made a drawing of the transit, this is Venus passing across the face of the sun when observed from the Earth. Happens somewhat erratically, like every 111 years or so. And observed from various points on the Earth, astronomers could be making observations of size and speed and calculating the distance of planets from each other. So an important event. This will accompany the article that was published in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society, an article that David wrote. When the transit actually happened, the story is that David fainted. His eulogizer, Dr. Benjamin Rush, said it was the result of that pleasure which attends the discovery or first perception of truth. A very lovely way to say it. David's interest in our solar system and in the skies only increased. In England, someone had developed this plan of the solar system with all of its planets and satellites in proportion and moving in relative speeds as it would in the universe, and it was called an orrery. Well, when Britain got one, our colony decided that we should have one too. And who might do this? A man who knew astronomy and clockworks. David was commissioned by the College of New Jersey, which would later become Princeton University, to make an orrery. This still exists. This is a photograph of the orrery in place in the building at Princeton University. And David proceeded. This was 1770 or so, 1769, 1770. David was now resident in Philadelphia. His family had moved to, I think it's 4th and Arch Streets, in a leased home. So also about this time, he starts making this orrery. And he was pledged to deliver it around 1771. Well, his dear friend, Dr. William Smith, who had been observing with him, when he got word that David was building an orrery for the College of New Jersey, he was shocked. And he pleaded with David, please do not deliver your orrery to the College of New Jersey before you have made and delivered one to the College of Philadelphia. So David tried to satisfy both of his clients, and he made 2 orreries. This is the one at the University of Pennsylvania, which can be seen on the upper floor of the new library. They are both purportedly in working order, but they are not operating when you go to see them. In the same year as these 2 major projects were due, David's wife died. It must have been a very trying time for him. 1770, Rittenhouse had moved into Philadelphia to lease a house at 7th and Arch. At about this time, he also bought property on the corner of 4th and Arch, and he built an observatory there. He would continue his observation of the stars his entire life, and he would be buried in the floor of his observatory. He lived at 7th and Arch from 1770 until 1786, when he bought a home, rather nice looking home, the corner of 4th and Arch, and it was right across the street from his observatory. His life expanded when he moved to Philadelphia. He became involved in the Patriot cause. He served on a number of committees, and we have evidence of that service. Here is David signing an order as Vice President of the Council of Safety in 1776. Council of Safety was an idea of Benjamin Franklin's and was established in the early 1770s, and it was a ruse of sorts. Franklin saw a need for the colonists to understand their defenses. He saw the possibility of war coming at them, and because of the Quaker influence, he felt that anything that had to do with war or defense would be rejected by them. And so he called his committee the Committee of Safety. He asked Rittenhouse to serve on that committee, and initially Rittenhouse was the engineer. And in that position, Rittenhouse helped take measure of their defenses on the Delaware River, and they calculated some kinds of placing of spikes and barriers that would keep the ships at bay. He also became involved in the hunt for gunpowder. That was the colonists' most significant need if they went to war, and they had none. They would later buy large quantities from France. But then, as you can see, David moved up to become vice president of this Council of Safety, and in fact, as Franklin moved up and served on at the national level, David moved into his position on the state legislature. In 1777, David was made treasurer of Pennsylvania, and he could serve on no other committee when he was treasurer, so he had to resign his seat in the legislature, and he served in the role of treasurer until 1789. We see some of his activities in that role. Here is David's signature on an original document. It is a transaction of the sale of land. His friend William Smith is involved with this. We see Smith's signature here. David was very busy. He also remarried shortly after his first wife died. He married in 1772, Hannah Jacobs, who would not have any children with David, but help him take care of his 2 daughters. In 1777, when the British occupied Philadelphia, David retreated to Lancaster, where the alternative seat of Pennsylvania government was during the British occupation. And then he returned to Philadelphia the following year. David was treasurer of Pennsylvania and continued into the 1780s in that role. He was also continuing his astronomical observations. So we see him cited in 1781 as the first American to cite Uranus. And we have David continuing his surveying operations. With the new nation, definitions were even more important. So we have Rittenhouse and the commission on which he served completing the Mason-Dixon line, boundaries with New York, and that was 1784, he continued the line for Mason-Dixon. He set the corner of Pennsylvania in 1773, and from this ran it north in 1785. And he enjoyed these jaunts. This was a camping trip for him. And part of a measure of his character are the stories of his enjoyment of meeting Native Americans when he traveled in the woods, and of his great courtesy to the Native Americans. He invited them to tea. In 1791, he became the successor president of the American Philosophical Society, which had been chaired by Benjamin Franklin, its founder, since its founder. So David was the second president. We also have him being invited. David had an ongoing conversation with Thomas Jefferson, and that's documented here. At least the letters, because we can trace that. But when Jefferson was Secretary of State to George Washington, he took on projects like establishing the weights and measures for our new country, and he consulted with Rittenhouse on this. When it became clear in the early 1790s that our new country needed its own currency, there were wild aberrations in the financial system, and having our own currency was seen as a way to stabilize things. Jefferson came to Rittenhouse to discuss this, and then asked him to head the first U.S. Mint. 1792 to 1795, Rittenhouse was the director of the Mint. This is a late-date portrayal of the first building. This was purpose-built at 7th and Filbert Streets, right down in David's neighborhood. It also happens to be the first building that was built by the new U.S. government. It doesn't exist anymore, but it's on the site of what is now the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia. So this picture retells a story that's perhaps more legend than reportage, and that is that George and Martha Washington donated their family silver, or portions of it, to be the first U.S. currency. This is a representation of what was called a half dime, spelled D-I-S-M-E. And the woman portrayed on that dime is purportedly Martha Washington, in tribute to the contribution that she and her family made to the U.S. currency. David also was the president of what was called the Democratic Republican Society of Pennsylvania. This was the beginning of a two-party system in America. Ideally, George Washington didn't want there to be any parties, but with his successors came a developing division of points of view about the important functions of government and how that should be conducted. And This is the Federalists portraying in satire what they called the Democratic Republicans, who were sort of a people's party, whereas the Federalists believed in strong government. David was part of the People's Party, a humble fellow, but it was also Jefferson's party, and I think David found sympathy with Jefferson's view his entire life. David died June 26, 1796. As I mentioned, he was buried in the floor of his observatory, place where he would come to peace.